Hello, and welcome to our fourth of a 5-installment video series on spiritual disciplines and lament. This series, created by Foundry United Methodist Church for its 2021 Lenten series, is designed to help you explore the gifts of lament and the spiritual disciplines which help us do it. Today, we will be exploring the work of lament as experienced and understood through centering prayer. Finding oneself in the presence of God is one of the central desires expressed in many of the Psalms. But for me, this desire is summed up nowhere better or more beautifully than in the 27th Psalm. In verse 4, the author writes these words, "One thing I ask from the Lord, this only do I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze on the beauty of the Lord and to seek God in God's temple." But what is the purpose of the author's desire? Why, other than being in the presence of the one who birthed being into being, would dwelling in the presence of God be a singular desire of their heart? The answer, we find, follows in the preceding verses. The author writes, "For in the day of trouble God will keep me safe in his dwelling. God will hide me in the shelter of God's sacred tent and set me high upon a rock. Then my head will be exalted above the enemies who surround me. I will sing and make music to the Lord." To dwell in the house of God, to live in God's presence, is not merely a nice idea or a faithful response to God's love for us. It is a wellspring of strength in tribulation, a foundation of hope in turbulent times, and an act of faith in God's desire and willingness to receive and respond to us in times of lament and sorrow. The word dwell, or yashab in Hebrew, is particularly important here. The intimacy of this word suggests not only that the author wishes to be or live in the presence of God, but indicates a reclined or opened posture, one in which their full self, as my grandmother sometimes says, warts and all, is not only revealed but expressed with ease. While Psalm 27 is not traditionally identified as a psalm of lament, its lesson in seasons of individual and communal lament is clear. Cultivating our awareness of and ability to enter God's presence is critical not only to sustain us, but to help us move from lament to liberation. Now, at this juncture in our series, it may seem as if we're studying lament for the sake of lament. In fact, many of you may feel tired of the word altogether, and it wouldn't be surprising. Lament is a disquieting thing for a nation, and too often a church, in which the ideal of the self-made person makes signs of weakness, failure, or anger anathema. Too often we're taught that our problems are our own to deal with, or made to believe that unhappiness or sorrow are signs of our own moral or personal failings. So we strive instead for joy, fueled by the power of positive thinking, made to believe that choosing to ignore lament is the only way to overcome it. The tired recipes of pull yourself up by your own bootstraps and thinking your way to healing fail to work. And why might this be? Perhaps it's because, as the psalmist points out, the liberation and hope for which we so long can only be found when we are willing to be intimately and openly honest with God about moments of sorrow, lament, and grief. Our study in this series has less to do with learning about lament for the sake of lament, and much more about exercising an emotional and spiritual muscle too often unexercised in our culture. Through the earnest and honest expression of lament, and the faithful invitation of God into our places of lament, we allow God the space God needs to speak into our life words of hope, healing, and wisdom, the words we need to move from the grips of lament into the liberation from the source of that lament, which only God can offer. This is the gist of dwelling in the house of the Lord, the cultivation of a spiritual kind of muscle memory in which, in moments of grief and sorrow, we are able to use that to help us, despite the compounding experience of grief and loss, and set intention with our belief in God's ultimate desire for our good. This is why, this week, we are inviting you to the practice of centering prayer. Of the spiritual disciplines that we've studied so far, centering prayer is perhaps the newest. Developed in its current form by Trappist monks in the 20th century, the practice does draw upon much older meditative traditions which focus on sitting in the presence of God. Recognizing that stilling the mind and quieting the heart is difficult, centering prayer allows us to practice what the psalmist calls dwelling in the house of the Lord. Unlike some prayer forms, centering prayer is neither discursive nor petitionary. Its purpose is not to make requests of God, to talk with God, or to express particular emotions toward God. Nor is it, like intercessory prayer, an attempt to accomplish something such as healing for another. Instead, centering prayer's primary purpose is to learn how to be with God. In this case, to be in the kind of loving, faithful relationship with God in which our full self, in both joy and sorrow, lament and celebration, can be presented. This means learning not only how to go to God with requests or complaints, but sitting in the presence of God and knowing and learning to trust that in God's presence we are held, loved, and fully known. It's important to note, especially if centering prayer sounds like a form of meditation, that it's not meditation in a classic or Eastern sense. Its purpose is not to empty oneself of thought or desire, nor is it to become one with the world around you. Rather, centering prayer is about opening up space so that God might enter into your being and share God's love, grace, forgiveness, and peace. If prayer is a form of relationship with God, centering prayer is our recognition that relationship is by its nature a dialogue. And before we can have dialogue with God, we must first learn to recognize God's voice, experience the feeling of God's presence, and create intentional space for God to be with us. One of the most difficult things people experience when practicing centering prayer is there's really no one right way to do it. There's no formula that we can use to begin to organize our thoughts or prepare ourselves. And its practice is as unique to us as the sound of our own voice. Only you will know what it takes for you to create the kind of space in which you're able to release the stuff that fills your hearts and minds, quiet your own voice and thoughts, and be present in a quiet and intentional way with God. And a great gift in it is that even for those of us who prefer structure, order, or control, centering prayer is something that we learn to do as we do it. As we practice centering prayer, we grow in our awareness, not only of God's presence in the moment in which we are practicing it, but in the abiding presence of God in our daily lives. Like the familiar sounds or smells of someone we love or a place we hold dear, as we come to know God's presence in this intentional way, so too do we begin to find through the practice of centering prayer the familiar signs of God's presence in all moments, no matter what we may be experiencing. Although there is no one right way to practice centering prayer, I want to offer you a few instructions as you begin to explore how you might apply it in your own spiritual practices. Begin by setting aside 10 to 15 minutes and find a place where you can sit comfortably. If this is your first time practicing centering prayer, you may choose to spend a little less time in silence. Silence can be hard the first time you try to create it. As you set time aside, set also your intention to be present with God and with what God will reveal to you in centering prayer. Trust that no matter what may come of the time that you will spend, God is with you and earnestly desires relationship with you. Next, find a sacred word that best captures your sincere desire to be in God's presence. It could be anything. Your word may be trust, or hope, held, or forgiven. Whatever your word is, let that word be an anchor for you, a word that you can use to draw you back into that intentional, quiet presence you've created when words, thoughts, or images interrupt your sincere desire to be in God's presence. As you sit, Quiet your hearts and minds and invite God to be with you. And then simply be. Try your best not to ask questions of God or express feelings toward God. As words, thoughts, or images interrupt your inner silence or your awareness of God's presence, use that anchor word you've selected to draw you back into that intentional inner silence. Acknowledge the words, thoughts, or images that interrupt your prayer, and then let them pass, returning to that sacred word as a way to reset and remind you of your intention. Often, in my own prayer practice, I find that I like to journal after centering prayer as a way to capture the feelings or experience of the time that I've spent with God. You may also wish to end times of petitionary or intercessory prayer with centering prayer, having offered to God what it is you bring, quieting yourself, and letting God speak into the space between you both. However you choose to incorporate centering prayer into your own prayer life, I encourage you to receive it as a way of learning to trust that God, the creator of all that is, so desires to know you in the intimacy of your experience, your heart, your life, and your joy and pain, that God makes God's self available to you at all times. All it takes from us is a willingness to make ourselves available to God. As we continue our journey of exploration through the discipline of lament, we know that lament is never the end of the story. The scripture reminds us that God's will is to turn our mourning into dancing, our weeping into laughter, our darkness into the brightness of the dawning sun. God longs for our healing, wholeness, and well-being. And by leaning into our lament, becoming familiar with how it makes us feel, think, and respond, and with our discomfort of it, and then inviting God into those experiences, we are creating the space that is necessary for God to speak with what the hymnist called wonderful words of life, words that liberate us from lament's grip and allow us to trust that even when we may be going through the storm, joy will indeed come in the morning. As the psalmist says in the final verses of Psalm 27, I believe that I shall see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Wait for the Lord, be strong, and let your heart take courage. Wait for the Lord. I believe that you and I too shall see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. And until that day arrives, that you and I are held in God's love, in which the fullness of our humanity is fully welcomed, and into which God desires nothing more than to enter and be our companion. Until next time, friends, blessings on the journey.